Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Inverted Podcast, where we discuss products and businesses and methods around things that protect you all. Security, abuse, spam, basically where success is when nothing happens. How do we build these products? How do we manage them? How do we sell them? And how do we use them? And how can we make the world a better place? And as always, I'm joined by Dario. Good afternoon. And special guest today, Vincent. Welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And Vincent, we asked you because you co-founded a company called Corbado that is basically leading a Passkey first authentication solution. And you help companies modernize their authentication. Now, we'll let you tell more about what that is, but for those of you who don't know what I just said, basically whenever you log in to any of your apps or on a website, that's what we call authentication, and you go through a number of steps. And some companies have really old stuff hooked up there. And some companies are very modern, like you could maybe see in some websites that you can log in without a password now. And Vincent, tell us, what does Corbado do in this space?
Absolutely. So Corbado is a Passkey analytics platform for enterprise consumer authentication. So we help large organizations in public, insurance, finance to deploy passkeys to their end users, to their customers. And the main issue that we've seen so far is that passkeys, the implementation is quite straightforward, but what actually is challenging is getting users to actively adopt them and to see why things might be not working as expected. And we help with different products and different insights that you can get from the Passkey authentication and other authentication methods to ultimately make the login passwordless and make it as seamless as possible.
Dario, if you don't have a question, I have a first question. I spoke to a massive company a few weeks ago, like more than 100,000 employees worldwide, and they went completely passwordless. And have you seen companies make transitions like this? And like, what does it take for a company to make such a transition? What are some of the steps that they might encounter?
I think going completely passwordless is like the end goal for many organizations. So when we say, okay, passkeys are a form of passwordless authentication, we see them kind of as a first step to roll out passkeys and to offer like a passwordless authentication method. But still, most organizations, they keep passwords as a fallback. Because I think you have to differentiate between workforce authentication, where you can force people to use something which is passwordless, but on the customer authentication side, you need to nudge the users, because otherwise they might churn, they might go to a competitor, or they just call in that they can't log in. So deploying passkeys is like a first step, and then I would say the second step is getting the adoption up. And then I think in a third wave, you could start to slowly fade out passwords for those users who haven't used them for a couple of months or weeks or login attempts. And once you feel confident, you can either let them voluntarily switch off passwords, or you just do it in the background. And that's what I've seen also large consumer-facing companies been doing, and it's been quite successful. But they could only do so because they had another form of authentication, passkeys in that case, implemented at scale with high adoption, and users felt comfortable to use passkeys as their primary authentication method.
Yeah, and so another question for you then, like you're saying, deploy passkeys first, make sure you have a backup method, and then once you have enough adoption, phase out the backup method. Let's go a bit from this one example that I jumped in straight because it popped in my mind, because I spoke to a massive company who went completely passwordless a few months ago. But let's jump up to the industry. Passkeys are relatively new if you compare them to the age of the internet, but they're also old if you compare them to the speed with which things are developing. So maybe Dario, can you start here? Like, can you describe a bit of the trends in authentication in the world? How are they changing? How is the way that people sign into their stuff changing?
Yeah, I think there's certainly two directions or a few aspects that push something like passkeys from succeeding. One of them is a increased use of mobile device or more interconnected devices like our computer and our mobile phone and other devices. They're more and more connected because they often come from the same ecosystem, or you have like other mechanisms that connect them with each other. So you start to have the benefit that if you have a if you have a mobile phone, you can start to use that to authenticate in a more secure way on a new desktop, on a new tablet, or on a smart TV. So I think that there's really a driver there. More people have more devices. Mobile devices have become the center of our digital life. And the next one is, we also see from a regulatory point of view, regulators all across the world start to push for standards, like to push the technology companies away from proprietary technologies that nobody else can use that locks into a vendor. So there's a push there, but also specifically to authentication. Like if you now talking about passkeys, obviously today, in authentication, there's a increased push to solve the phishing problem. Like phishing has been a problem for like the last couple of decades, and it's such an old problem that people tend to make fun of it as a low-tech cyber attack that only other people, obviously never the people who make fun of phishing, would ever fall for it. But it's still the major problem. I just spoke the other day to one of the major global banks, and they still say on the consumer side, phishing is their main problem when it comes to accounts takeover. So we've been talking about that for years or for decades, and everybody comes up with a proprietary technology to make phishing less likely to happen. And it seems like regulators have just gotten sick and tired of it. And so more and more regulators start to say, you have to deploy phishing-resistant technology. Like, it's not enough to reduce phishing. It's just like, now you have to go and do phishing-resistant technology, meaning technology that deterministically prevents phishing from even succeeding. So we have countries like Australia, Japan, in the UK, the US to some extent, a little bit less in Europe, where regulators really start to be pushing their constituents, meaning banks, insurances, and other companies to say, you have to prevent phishing in a deterministic way. So I think those are really those elements that drive this momentum, combined with vendors now, or like platform vendors having aligned on a set of standards to support. And that's certainly different from maybe 10 years ago, where everybody thought they have their own passwordless solution and it just was too fragmented. So I don't know, Vincent, if you see other drivers, maybe from a regulatory or from a market dynamics point of view.
I mean, the regulatory point is quite interesting, because actually yesterday, the Japanese FSA, I think that's the financial regulator in Japan, they launched a consumer-facing campaign to make phishing-resistant MFA or passkeys something more accessible to the general public. And they had quite funny, you can look it up, quite funny posters and posts about why passkeys are better and why you should move off passwords, off SMS, OTP to something phishing resistant. So that's quite 100% agree with your regulator's point. And I think the other thing which is important is that the consumers or the users, they feel quite comfortable using biometrics to log in. I think nowadays, most of the people, they use Face ID, Touch ID, or the Android equivalent to unlock their device and then moving that behavior. And I think they do it, recently read a study, 80 times a day, you unlock your phone, and moving that behavior to websites and apps, it's just a logical next step for authentication.
I have a question about that logical next step, right? A few weeks ago, we've recorded a podcast that's live at the time of this recording, where we interviewed a hijacking victim. So a small YouTuber that got their account hacked. And in the interview, we tried to ask this YouTuber, like, what kind of sign-in were you using? And in our mind, that's like an authenticator, or OTP or Passkey or whatever. And she said, "Oh, I don't know. I just use my fingerprint." So how do we help users transition from this world where they have a username, password that's already tough to manage, and then they have to manage a third thing, which was SMS or text message? Now there's many more options. And then if I ask anybody to explain a passkey, like especially when passkeys just launched on Google accounts in 2024, I think, I sat next to someone and they got the passkey challenge for the first time. And they shouted to me, Jeroen, it asked me for a passkey. I don't have a passkey. And I was about to get up and walk over. Oh, it's just my fingerprint. Oh, just ask me for my fingerprint. And I don't have a passkey. I don't remember making one. So I'm not saying our systems are bad, right? I'm just wondering, like, how do you address the challenge of taking users along from the old to the new, Vincent? What are some of the success stories you've seen?
I think we spent a lot of time on that question. I think the best login system actually doesn't make the user think. So it always suggests the most secure and the simplest login method. And I think in the consumer world, it's passkeys and using Face ID, Touch ID or fingerprint and face scan to log in. However, you need to nudge users to move off those phishable methods, passwords, which they have been using for decades, to passkeys. And to your point that those users or colleague you spoke to, they don't know passkeys, and they probably also don't need to understand the technology that works behind. Maybe a rough understanding is fine. Just phrase it like, use your fingerprint to log in, use your face to scan or to log in the next time, make it easier, make it simpler. And when we did some A/B testing, that's also what resonated the most with average users, because they don't bother what the technology is underlying. They just want to log in quickly, and if that has a benefit in terms of being phishing resistant, I think that's just a very, very helpful, or not only helpful, a tremendous step forward in security.
Dario, what have you seen? What are some of the things you've seen? You've seen many customers try to implement passkeys or improve their authentication. How do they take their users or employees along?
Yeah, I think it's really a question of, one of the questions that I often ask people is, what do they want to achieve with passkeys? I think people have different goals in order to define what makes a transition away from passwords successful for them, and then you optimize for that. I think, as Vincent said, the difficult part is to start to convince people that passkeys are there and that they should start to use them. I mean, you can't log in with a passkey if you haven't created one. So that's really, you build a foundation in the beginning where over time you start to tell people, here's an alternative to what you've known for so long. But it's hard to make people change because password is the devil, you know. Like, everybody is annoyed by passwords, but at least you know that if you strand on a deserted island and go to a internet cafe, which who knows if deserted islands still have internet cafes, but like if you go there, you know how to log in. But certainly that fear is that with passkey that doesn't work. So you have to go in a transition with a lot of people where you help them build up the confidence that they're not losing access to their information. I think, having said that, there's also audiences where you could be more opinionated, and I've seen that as well. That where relying parties take some of their audiences, and sometimes, for example, new users, and switch to passkey only or passkey first approach with new users before they even do with the existing ones, because they don't have yet a predefined expectations on how logging in on that specific website or in that specific app works. So you have a bit of an easier audience if you start with new users. And the advantage there is you have new users who already have an account that's either has an unphishable authentication method to it or is unphishable because it doesn't have any phishable method anymore. So find your journey. Companies do it out of different motivations. Some do it because they want to increase retention when people change devices. Others do it to reduce step-up authentication hurdle, and then in the banking sector, we often see it to do stronger authentication for compliance reasons, and figure out how to measure that goal that you have and see how close to that goal does passkeys take you. But don't have expectations that you can just flip the switch and say, we delete the whole password database tonight, and tomorrow morning everybody logs with a passkey. That is certainly not especially in the consumer space. As Vincent said, in enterprise, you can dictate what your employees use. You can make sure that all of your employees have a modern device. But in consumer world, you don't have that luxury.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Because even this company that I spoke to that has like hundreds of thousands of employees that went passwordless, it took them years, and they first had to take the inventory of all the apps that need passwords, or even first all the apps they use, right? And then once they have a list of all the apps they use, they have to go one by one to see which one can, accept a passkey or a passwordless sign-in. And then obviously there's always a few thousand apps that they can't accept passkeys or passwordless sign-in. And then you still have to allow users to go back to a password sign-in for a little while so that they can at least do their stuff. So maybe we talked a bit about the benefits of modernizing your authentication, right? So we say it's more secure, obviously. If you use passkeys, there's also a usability benefit. And are there any other benefits for customers to modernize their authentication besides these two?
I think for customers, it's the security uplift and it's just simpler. You don't need to remember a password. I think what's interesting on the company side, so if you're more like in a transaction-oriented business, let's say e-commerce, payment, I think passkeys, and that's also what we've seen in the data, they actually can help you to increase conversion, to allow for more purchases, reduce drop-off. And I think now passkeys are for the very first time in authentication a method that not only makes the security part of the equation better, but also like the success rates for logging in, and that usually then translates in these industries to more revenue, more sales. And now I think more product people or more like customer experience people also take note of passkeys, at least what we see in the consumer side. And I think that's quite interesting because it can really help you to help with drop off and with lowering or with increasing the conversion rates.
Yeah, and I think it's because it's supported by so many different platforms. I mean, like most iOS devices, most Android devices, most Windows devices support passkeys at this stage. So the companies can start to rely on a more consistent experience across different devices, rather than having to implement something that just works on mobile but doesn't work on desktop, or works much better on one operating system than the other. So the hurdles are really going down, and that makes the motivations so much more appealing. There's also a money-saving element to it. I mean, we've gone through SMS as an authentication, or often as a recovery method, for so many years, and the problems with SMS from a security point of view are certainly well documented and well discussed. But there's also a cost element for SMS. Like if you send text messages in large quantities, those text messages get more and more expensive because nobody else sends text messages anymore other than relying parties using SMS 2FA. So the prices go up. And I've seen companies who spend just a fortune, more money than I will ever see on my bank account, on text messages on a daily basis. It sounds like it's such a non-critical expense, but if you count that up to millions or hundreds of millions of users, it becomes a lot of money.
Do we also see improvements on like the help desk side or like other things? Because I'm trying to think about, if I have a company in front of me that says, no, we're not ready to modernize our authentication stack, right? We're not ready to modernize the way users sign into our accounts. Let it be a bank or an e-commerce platform, or I don't know, my grocery frequent shopper app, or my school messaging app. There's so many different examples now where you have so many accounts now. What are some of the main arguments to not do it yet, Vincent, that you hear? Why not modernize auth?
I think it's the saying, don't never change a running system. So I think authentication is quite a crucial part, or it's kind of the gateway to your service. And as long as it works and doesn't break, most are just afraid of touching it because it could confuse the users. And if you do it wrong, they might just churn in e-commerce, or they might flood your support with requests that they can't log in. And I think this is the biggest fear. And also, secondly, I mean, passkeys, even though the standard, the FIDO Alliance and the Web of N standard itself, they have existed for quite a while, it's still something new. And most people that I speak with, they maybe have done one deployment or might have read about it, but they don't have like the experience of doing it for like the fifth or sixth time. So they still are kind of afraid what can happen at scale. And that's also what we see when you deploy passkeys to millions of users. In the consumer world, you have different browsers, operating systems, credential managers, devices, and you can't test for it all in advance. So you deploy and then you see things break. And some operating system versions introduce new updates. It silently breaks. Even Apple and Google every now and then have some smaller features that don't work as expected. So there's, I would say, some uncertainty in the market, and you just fear, okay, you could make things even worse if you don't do it properly. So that's what I hear quite often. And of course, you need to invest into implementing it first before you see the payoff of less SMS costs, less support calls. So there's always some kind of initial invest needed to get passkeys into your product.
So that's the sunk cost problem, right? And the fear. Any thoughts from you, Dario?
Yeah, I think there's also, especially like if you go into regulated markets like financial services, there's still like a lack of precedence that passkeys are being deployed by tier one banks in a way that and the effect it has. So I remember in the beginning of passkeys when passkeys started to become a thing, and Apple said they will support this cloud syncable authentication method based on WebAuthn and FIDO. Most banks would say, we will never we will never support this for our banking login, because banks are afraid of releasing control over authentication methods and key material. So the fear that now the key that allows you to log into your bank account or to approve a transaction is on an iCloud account or on a Google Password Manager or 1Password or whatever cloud infrastructure that the banks have no influence on. That fear made them very uncomfortable in the beginning. It's also not 100%, like it's still debated how it fits into, for example, European compliance language. But we really start to see some banks embracing it as what it is, a cloud sync password, for example, as a password replacement. You still have your legacy MFA infrastructure. If you want to tie a session to a mobile app, you do that. But in order to really get rid of the passwords, there's some banks that really start to embrace passkeys in a way that probably the same banks 4 years ago would have said, we will never do that. So I think it requires another 1 or 2 iterations, and some of those tier one banks to really come out and use passkeys in a way that they are not using them today, for them to be used as a reference and as a case of precedence that security, compliance, and all of these aspects can be held up with something that seems so consumer focused as passkeys. But I mean, as you all know, banks move slowly. The decision-making process is long. Their technology life cycles are very long. So we just need to be a little bit more patient to see how are they deciding to use phishing-resistant authentication, and then we will see more followers coming.
Yeah, and there was one interesting thing that happened a few months ago where I spoke to a customer, and they say, yeah, we need to change passwords once every 6 months. And I said, why? That's known to make it worse. No, because our auditor requires us to do that. So even the auditor, or you ask someone, hey, why are you getting a cyber insurance, and what do you need to fill in? And then they said, yeah, there's a PDF that the cyber insurance company sent me that tells me I have to tell them how many servers am I running, and like, I don't know, we hosted a cloud provider. I don't know how many servers they have. For me, it might change per minute. So I guess regulators on the one hand are helping, but on the other hand, they're also still slow to catch up to this idea of passkeys. And I think that's both. Yeah, they're helping at least also on this side, not just slowing down. I have another question to you, Vincent. Passkeys was the new thing of the last couple of years. What are some other innovations that you think might be coming along?
I think in the identity space, I think quite closely related to passkeys are verifiable or digital credentials. I think that's kind of the logical next step after authentication to also get identity, which works to a certain degree and similar or same standards. This is something that I definitely see as the new kid on the horizon. And then, of course, AI and agentic identity, how that will evolve is something which is quite interesting. I mean, some standards and some work is already or was already done, but I think we will see much more development over the next months, weeks, and years, of course.
Agentic identity, I think that's a really good point. We need to talk about AI, of course, because we are used to be in a world where I, as a human, log in to something and I authenticate at that point, and whatever happens after, we kind of trust it. And we use a cookie or some other identifier to hold that state and to give some value to that sign in, so that if I sign in with my passkey, maybe this session is more trustworthy than if I sign in with just my password, and maybe I can do a bit more before maybe I can send more emails or upload more stuff, whatever. But now that session can spawn off an agent, and that agent could be spawned by a very low trust session and do a whole bunch of things, or it might be a high trust session, but it might do something I totally didn't intend. What is your view on that? I want to start with Dario and then let's go to Vincent. What is your view on that, Dario, like authentication in the age of AI?
Yeah, I think it unlocks a completely different dynamic, as you said. Like, it's not just us having an interaction with a website or a mobile app where things happen pretty much in real time. Like, I go and buy something, so I confirm that purchase, or I go and share a piece of content, and then that content is going to be visible for everybody indefinitely. With us having AI agents acting on our behalf, or like impersonation or delegation, we're going to see much more dynamics that are not as in real time, that are harder to control. So we need methods in which we as humans can give intent, tell the AI systems what we want to do, what we want them to achieve, and under what circumstances that should happen. So passkeys are a great way to establish a root of trust cryptographically, or like a phishing-resistant root of trust with a system. But then once we establish that, then we need to tell the AI agent, here's the information you're allowed to use for your transaction, and here's how long you want to use it. I think that's where wallets and verifiable credentials will really come in, because then we start to combine all of the assets we have. It's like, for example, if I want to buy a bottle of wine for somebody's birthday, then I need to provide them some information, but I also want to make sure that information is only available for
and that they don't spend $10,000 on a bottle of wine.
Exactly. I mean, like, I give the intent of, like, I want them to get a nice bottle of wine, and I know what they like, or maybe the AI system knows what they like. But these are the guardrails of, like, how much I want to spend, when I want to spend it, and that I'm allowed to give them this privilege to spend that money, but then not give an indefinite blanco check that they have to then fill out, and that can bankrupt me.
So you're saying,
or in the end, instead of wine, they're ordering something illegal.
So you're saying passkeys is root of trust, but then an additional authentication moment or verification moment or human in the loop moment to verify intent is needed. So we need to start building a new form of authentication standard in the industry. That's not a session start, but a bless my agent type of moment, or bless this agent action. Vincent,
I think.
Go ahead.
A contract framework. We need to. We're defining new contract frameworks, because the contract is not between two humans or a human and a website, but the contract is between me and an AI agent. Then that goes on my behalf and goes wherever and buys that bottle of wine, or those flowers, or books a ticket.
Vincent, I have two questions for you. Number one is that, like, what do you see? How do we need to modernize our authentication thinking in the world of agents? And number two, very specifically, should agents have their own accounts, or should they act on your behalf?
Two very good questions. So let's start with the first one. Two aspects. Authentication in the age of agents and AI. I think first of all, agents could also be used the other way to attack the current auth system. I think that ties back to what Dario mentioned at the beginning. It's nowadays with Gen AI even impossible to distinguish between a legitimate email that asks for your credentials and a fraudulent one. And I think there it becomes even more pressing to build phishing-resistant authentication into products, because the benefit of Passkeys then is because you can't distinguish between those two pages as a human. The technology will just not allow you to use credentials on a fraudulent website. And I think this is quite important to just know. And the other aspect is I'm quite often asked, can an agent use my passkey? And the thing is, actually no, because for using a passkey, you always need a human to be present to either click somewhere or type something or scan something. And that's by design. And I think this should stay as is. However, and that might be then an opportunity, you can use a passkey in kind of a step-up moment to basically then finish the purchase when you already let the agent go and look for flowers, look for wines. But then the final confirmation should be done by a human. So this might be something. And to your second question, or can you just repeat the second question?
Should agents have their own separate identity, or should they act on your behalf?
Well, I think they should have a separate identity. However, that should be tied to your account, to your identity in some way, so that it's still distinguishable who made the purchase. Was it you sitting in front of your computer surfing for a bottle of wine, or did you send the agent to pursue the task and purchase the bottle of wine for you? I think it's still, in terms of traceability and observability, important to understand who really did something, because it's so quickly evolving and agents are still doing mistakes. So having that kind of understanding who did what is, in my opinion, important. So I would keep it separate, but still tied together in what way ever.
So then,
I think we'll see use cases. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Vincent. Okay, if an agent is a separate entity from me, how does it have its own authentication? If my mom is listening to this and thinking, oh, I want to launch an agent to do the shopping for me, does that agent sign in on its own behalf into the shopping website, or does it use my mom's credentials? And if so, then how do they hand it over?
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, I haven't really thought about that in that much depth, so I can't give you like a very recent answer. It's just from the principles that I see. I would keep it separate, but yeah, fair point. Maybe you can also get the agent to log into your account. But again, coming back to my answer, I would still kind of keep a system where you can distinguish between who did what, and if there might be some different scoped tokens, for instance, that you could use between, hey, this is an agent logging into your system, you might have a similar or related identity, and that's not a human who actually owns the account and who also logged in with a passkey or password, whatever. So yeah, that's how I see it, but I didn't spend too much time looking into how do we split up identities yet. Maybe you, Dario, or you don't have a better idea.
I think we'll still see, and I think we're in a huge, significant transition. I always think there's a few different models of how agents either represent or impersonate us, and that depends a bit on who is the owner of the agent, on whose side does the agent have to be. I think when it comes to, for example, let's think about shopping, like the shopping case where I have an agent that has access to the content of my fridge, and that agent interacts with another AI system on the retailer side, because the retailer wants to make it easy for AI-based systems to shop with them. I think it probably a separate identity makes sense, because they want to have they have a smaller scope in privileges and in rights. But for example, when I think about like airlines, it's probably most airlines won't have an interest of AI-based systems to scout for the cheapest price. Like the efforts airlines go through today to make sure that I get dynamic pricing, and it's hard for me to reverse engineer how to get the cheapest price. I have to sign into VPNs, change countries, go with different browsers change devices. Like all of those factors have an impact on price. So the interest of an airline to make it possible for me to fully automate the painful process of booking the cheapest flight from A to B, they have no interest in allowing me to use AI for that. So in that case, probably the identity will be me impersonating me and making it that it passes their anti-AI agent detections. So it's like it's a bit like buying and selling a house. Depending on whose side is the seller, is the agent paid by the seller or by the buyer? And I think that will have an impact on what type of identities will be used. But I think where we're probably more in alignment is it needs to be trackable and traceable, and you need to be able to audit what happened at what point, especially if money is involved, because in the end you need to make sure that what happened is actually what the consumer gave the consent to, and if there's a dispute, to find out on which side has the mistake happened.
Maybe one other angle putting on top of that, I think. Sorry, because I spent quite some time on search engine optimization and also how you can optimize content for large language models. You always have to distinguish between the user experience to make it readable and understandable for humans. And then I think there's the agent experience. And an agent might like something quite simple, very structured, whereas a human always appreciates the visual elements. And I think having the opportunity to distinguish between who's accessing your service or your website or your content, it's quite important to optimize for both parties, because even in the age of agents and AI, there will still be humans in the loop who want to buy something, who want to purchase something, who want to visit a website. So you should not neglect this part, and then providing optimization for both ends is, I think, quite important. So you need to distinguish between those two identities.
Yeah, so basically we're saying sometimes you want to separate the agent and give him its own identity because that is better, and then give it its own credentials. Obviously, we have with OpenClaw, when that came on, people were saying you need to have a dedicated laptop that has no access to anything private. I've heard people that say, you give it its own Gmail account, its own Slack, its own everything, and then you can interact with it as a person. But then you say on other moments, you actually don't want to be seen, you don't want to be represented by an agent. You want whoever you're interacting with to think that it's actually you, and then so in order to hide from agent detection for whatever reason, right? And I guess the sign-in story is very different in both cases. In the separate identity case, the agent signs in with its own credentials into its own Gmail account, and you can basically enforce certain things. And in the other cases, basically you hand it your own sign-in to, and that is a bit scary, but yeah, we still have to figure that out. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, and I think that's where revocability and more granular permissions really come in, because neither of those cases you should install OpenClaw on your work computer and give it access to your full file system.
Yes. Thanks so much to you both. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the new trends in authentications, what the advantages are of adopting modern things like passkeys for users, for companies. We talked about what are reasons not to adopt it. We've also talked a bit about authentication in the age of AI, and that we have a lot of ground to cover. Thanks, Vincent, for joining. All the best with Corbado. I hope you get lots of people to adopt passkeys, because it'll just be really much better for the world. And thanks as always to Dario for joining. And to those of you watching or listening, thank you so much as always for tuning in. You can find us on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and on your favorite platform. And you can reach out to us with questions or ideas. And as always, remember that saving one is worth it. And see you in the next one.